the penthouse was never loud. But tonight, it was the kind of quiet that had teeth. Seoul's rain-soaked skyline bled orange and silver through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread below like a kingdom that owed him everything, and it did. Every neon sign, every back-alley deal, every whispered name spoken in fear across 23 districts, all of it answered to one man. Yun-Seo didn't look like a king right now. He sat at the edge of the master bed, still in his suit, his tie loosened but not removed, his Rolex catching the low bedroom light. In his hands that had signed death warrants without a tremor, hands that men twice his size had begged, sat a small leather-bound diary. Burgundy. Worn soft at the corners. Tied shut with a simple cream ribbon. It had been folded inside Samara's silk robe. He'd only reached for the robe because it still smelled like her, sandalwood and something warmer, something he had never learned the name of and never bothered to ask. He hadn't meant to find it. That was the part that would haunt him. The first page stopped him cold. Not because of what it said about him, though it said everything about him. But because of how she'd said it. No rage. No bitterness. Just a woman quietly, faithfully, heartbreakingly loving a man who had never once looked up long enough to notice. Yun-Seo's jaw tightened. His eyes, dark and still as a winter lake, moved across her handwriting, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, his hands were not steady. Welcome to Mafia Moonlight Tales, where love walks into the darkest rooms and refuses to leave. If this story already has your attention, go ahead and smash that like button, subscribe so you never miss a new tale, drop a comment below telling us what you think Samara's diary said, and share this video with someone who believes love can change even the coldest soul. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To understand what broke Yun-Seo Han that rainy Thursday night, you first have to understand what he was built to be, and what he had spent 36 years convincing the world he was. Yun-Seo Han was not born powerful. He was forged that way, the way steel is forged, under enormous pressure and unbearable heat, until everything soft burns away and only the blade remains. Second-generation Korean, raised in the underbelly of a city that rewarded ruthlessness and buried sentimentality, he had inherited the Haon Syndicate at 24 when his father was assassinated by a rival faction. Most men would have collapsed under the weight of that legacy. Yun-Seo had instead done something far more dangerous, he had grown it. By 36, he stood 6'1" in custom black suits that cost more than most people's annual salaries. His jaw was angular, his features sharp and composed, handsome in the severe, architectural way of a man who had never needed charm because he had never needed anyone's approval. A dragon tattoo climbed his neck, its scales detailed in traditional Korean ink, the head resting just below his right ear, a deliberate statement to every associate, rival, and government official who sat across from him: I am not pretending to be dangerous. I simply am. He spoke in measured, low tones. He never raised his voice, because he had never needed to. The men who worked for him said that his silence was more terrifying than any threat, that when Yun-Seo went still and quiet, someone was always about to have a very bad night. He ran 3 legitimate businesses as cover, a real estate development firm, a high-end security consultancy, and an import company with offices in Seoul, Tokyo, and Singapore. He attended charity galas with the ease of a man born into ballrooms. He sat on corporate boards. He shook hands with politicians. And he came home every night to Samara. Samara Han, née Samara Adeyemi, was not what anyone expected of a crime lord's wife. She was not flashy. She was not on social media. She did not drip in jewelry or demand a spotlight. She was 32, with deep brown skin that glowed warm against the cold marble of their penthouse, skin that seemed to hold light rather than reflect it. Her natural hair fell in thick, dark coils past her shoulders when she wore it loose, though she usually pinned it up in an elegant twist for the events she attended on Yun-Seo's arm. Her eyes were wide, long-lashed, and perceptive, the kind of eyes that noticed details other people walked past. She was the daughter of a Nigerian-American professor of literature and a community healthcare administrator. She held a master's degree in social work and ran a registered charitable foundation that funded educational programs and victim relief across 3 cities. She was the kind of woman who remembered the names of waiters and asked follow-up questions about their families 2 months later. On the surface, she and Yun-Seo made no sense. The city certainly thought so. The whispers in his world ran dark and curious. Why her? What is her angle? What does she know that keeps her safe? Yun-Seo had encouraged that ambiguity. Let them wonder. A wife who appeared gentle and civic-minded was excellent cover, and Samara had never once behaved in a way that disrupted his operations or attracted the wrong kind of attention. She was composed. Private. Graceful at formal dinners, invisible afterward. She asked him no questions about his work and made no demands on his time. He had told himself, early in their arrangement, that this was the perfect setup. He told himself she had married him for security. For the Han name, its protection, its financial cushion, the invisible armor it draped around everyone who stood close enough to him. It was a reasonable conclusion. A practical one. The kind of conclusion a man makes when he processes human relationships the way a general reads a battlefield, always looking for the strategy, the leverage, the mutual transaction beneath every gesture. They slept in the same bed. They attended the same events. They shared meals in their cavernous dining room, separated by 12 feet of marble and the particular silence of two people who had never found the language to reach each other across the distance. He looked at her the way you look at a beautiful painting you purchased for a reason, present, acknowledged, unexamined. He had never once asked her why she stayed. Tonight, holding her diary in the half-dark while her scent still clung to the room around him, he was beginning to understand, with the slow, shattering comprehension of a man whose entire worldview is being dismantled page by page, that he had never asked because some part of him was afraid of the answer. He had been right to be afraid. Because Samara's diary did not contain a betrayal. It contained something infinitely worse. It contained the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was that this quiet woman, this woman he had catalogued as uncomplicated, had been loving him in secret for years. Not passively. Not simply. But actively, strategically, sacrificially, in ways he was only now beginning to count, and the count kept climbing, and his chest kept tightening, and the rain kept falling on the city below. He turned to the second page. And Yun-Seo Han, feared leader of the most powerful crime syndicate in the region, began to read about the night his wife had saved his soul, a night he didn't even know had happened. The diary was dated 3 years ago. The night he thought no one had seen. He was wrong about that too. Stay with us at Mafia Moonlight Tales. The story is just beginning, and trust us, you are not ready for what Samara wrote. They had married on a Tuesday. Not a Saturday, not in a garden draped with flowers and the expectation of forever. A Tuesday, quiet, efficient, witnessed by 2 attorneys and Yun-Seo's second-in-command, Min Jae, who had stood in the corner of the registrar's office with his hands folded and his expression carefully neutral. The entire thing had taken 11 minutes. Samara had worn a cream dress, simple and well-fitted, and she had signed her name in clear, unhurried cursive without a single tremor in her hand. He had respected that. He still did. The arrangement had been brokered through her uncle, a man who moved quietly between legitimate business and the kind of circles that overlapped with Yun-Seo's world. The terms were clean. Samara would carry the Han name, maintain the appearance of a stable domestic life, and ask no questions. In return, she received financial security, the protection of his name, and a penthouse that most people would consider a small paradise. It was, by every metric Yun-Seo used to evaluate such things, a fair deal. He had been 33. She had been 29. Neither of them had pretended it was anything other than what it was. Or so he had believed. In the early months, he had watched her the way he watched new associates, carefully, from a distance, cataloging her habits and waiting for the angle to reveal itself. Every person who entered his life carried a want. A need. Something they were steering toward beneath the surface of their politeness. He had learned this young and he had never once been proven wrong. But Samara was difficult to read. She didn't redecorate aggressively or assert herself into his routines. She didn't question his hours or flinch at the nights he came home smelling like tension and rain and other people's fear. She installed herself into the penthouse the way water fills a space, quietly, completely, without disturbing the architecture. She cooked on Sunday evenings, filling the kitchen with smells that had no business being in a building like theirs, jollof rice, pepper soup, things that reminded him, uncomfortably, of warmth. She left books on the coffee table. She kept a small prayer journal on her nightstand that he had never touched and never asked about. She was, he had concluded, playing a very long and very patient game. He had almost admired it. Publicly, she was everything he needed. Elegant at his side during the dinners and the galas, never overstepping, never drawing the kind of attention that created problems. She charmed his associates' wives without revealing a single true thing about herself. She laughed at the right moments and went quiet at the right moments, and she always knew when to leave a room. Privately, he had filed her under uncomplicated and moved on. Their conversations, such as they were, lived in the shallows. The weather. His schedule. Whether the kitchen needed restocking. Occasionally she would say something that surprised him, a dry, precise observation about someone they had met that was so accurate it made him pause, but he never followed the thread. He would nod. She would let it go. The silence would return and they would both breathe easier inside it, or at least he had assumed they both did. He had never considered that the silence might be costing her something. He had never considered her at all, not really, not as a full and interior person with depths that existed beyond what was useful to him. She was present. She was composed. She was, in his private and unexamined shorthand, a beautiful shadow, one that fell across his life at appropriate angles and asked nothing of the light. He had been so certain she felt the same. The diary, open now in his unsteady hands, was about to teach him what certainty costs a man who has never once bothered to look. The first entry was dated 4 years ago. Nearly 8 months before their marriage. Before her uncle had made the introduction. Before the attorneys and the registrar and the 11-minute ceremony. Before any of it. Yun-Seo's eyes moved to the top of the page and stayed there for a long moment, something cold and unfamiliar pressing against the inside of his chest. I saw him for the first time at the Hansung Foundation dinner. He walked in 20 minutes late and the entire room shifted, not toward him, the way people move toward someone they admire, but away from him, the way a crowd parts for something they instinctively understand is not safe. He didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he had simply stopped expecting anything different. He remembered that dinner. He had gone because the foundation's director owed him a conversation and public settings made men like the director more cooperative. He had stayed 40 minutes, said what needed saying, and left. He could not have told you a single other detail about that night. Samara, apparently, could tell him everything. He stood at the edge of the room near the windows, and I watched him look out at the city the way people look at things they used to want. There was nothing cold about it. I know everyone in that room saw a dangerous man. I saw someone who had forgotten what he was standing in a room full of people who would never remind him. Yun-Seo stopped reading. He read the passage again. He had spent years cultivating that coldness, had sharpened it deliberately, maintained it the way other men maintained their reputations or their physiques, with daily discipline and zero sentimentality. It was not a mask. It was infrastructure. And every person in every room he had ever entered had responded to it correctly, with distance, with deference, with the particular careful respect that lives 1 degree from fear. Samara had looked at him standing by those windows and seen a lost boy. He turned the page with a hand that wasn't quite steady. He ordered a drink he didn't touch. He checked his watch 3 times in 4 minutes. At one point, a man approached him, someone important, judging by the way the room watched, and he smiled the way people smile when smiling is simply another form of control. But just before the man reached him, just for a second, his expression slipped. Not into anger. Not into arrogance. Into something exhausted. Something that looked, from where I was standing, exactly like loneliness. I don't think he knew I saw it. I don't think anyone else did. People only see what they're looking for. Yun-Seo set the diary down on the bed beside him. He pressed both hands against his knees and looked at the rain-streaked window across the room, the city burning quietly below, and he tried to locate the version of himself from that night, the controlled, untouchable version, and hold on to it. He couldn't find it. Because she had described him perfectly. Not the performance of him. Not the reputation. The thing underneath, the part he had buried so deep and kept so dark he had half convinced himself it no longer existed. She had seen it at a distance, at a fundraising dinner, before she had ever spoken a word to him, and she had written it down like it mattered. Like he mattered, not as a power, not as a name, but as a person who was clearly, visibly, privately suffering. He picked the diary back up. I didn't speak to him that night. There was nothing to say, and I think he would have deflected it anyway. But I thought about him on the drive home. I thought, whoever loves that man is going to have to love him loudly enough for both of them, because he has clearly forgotten how to hear it. I wondered if anyone ever would. His throat tightened. He turned the page. The entry was dated 14 months into their marriage. A Wednesday in November. Yun-Seo knew immediately which night she meant before he had finished the first line. Some nights branded themselves into memory whether you wanted them there or not. This one had. He had simply never imagined it had branded itself into hers as well. He came home at 2 a.m. I was awake. I heard the elevator, then the long silence in the entryway that meant he was standing there composing himself before he moved through the apartment. He does that. He thinks I'm asleep. I have never told him otherwise. Yun-Seo's jaw tightened. When he finally came to bed, I could smell it. Not blood exactly, something beneath blood. The particular heaviness that clings to a person who has been in the presence of something irreversible. I lay still and kept my breathing even, and I listened to him sit on the edge of the bed for a long time without moving. A very long time. Long enough that I had to remind myself to keep breathing slowly, because what I wanted to do was reach for him. I didn't. He would have rebuilt every wall in an instant, and the walls weren't what needed tending to that night. He stood abruptly. Crossed to the window. Stood with his back to the diary, the city below him, his reflection ghosted in the glass, suit jacket still on, jaw set, the dragon tattoo a dark curl against his neck. He stayed that way for nearly a minute. Then he went back. Sat down. Kept reading. In the morning, he was gone before I woke. Or before I was meant to wake. I got up and found his shirt from the night before folded at the bottom of the laundry hamper, buried under other things. He had tried to be thorough. He almost was. There was a small stain on the left cuff, faint, already rinsed, the kind of thing most people would miss. I didn't miss it. I removed the shirt before the housekeeper arrived. I soaked it myself, in the bathroom off the guest room, with the door locked. I didn't pray while I did it. I prayed after, when my hands were dry, and what I prayed was not what most people would expect. Yun-Seo turned the page slowly. I didn't pray for him to stop. I have made peace with the fact that I cannot reach into a man's life and remove the parts that formed him, the violence, the world he was handed at 24 when his father's blood was still fresh and the syndicate needed a face and there was only his face available. I prayed instead for his soul to stay soft enough, somewhere underneath all of it, to still be capable of return. I prayed for the exhausted man I had watched at that window 2 years prior. I prayed he was still in there. I chose to stay that morning. Not because I had no options. I have always had options. I stayed because leaving felt like abandonment, and I have never been able to abandon something still living. He will never know about the shirt. That is fine. Some forms of love are not meant to be witnessed to be real. The rain outside had grown heavier. Yun-Seo could hear it against the glass, a low, relentless sound, like the city itself was trying to confess something. He sat perfectly still on the edge of their bed, the diary open across his knees, and for the first time in more years than he could honestly count, he felt something crack open in the center of his chest. Not painfully. Worse than painfully. The way light enters a room that has been dark for a very long time. He turned to the next entry with the particular desperation of a man who no longer wants to stop. The next entry was dated 8 months ago. Spring. He recognized the time frame instantly. Spring had been particularly brutal this year. 3 territorial disputes compressed into 6 weeks, each one resolved in the language his world understood best. He had kept the body count low by his standards, which was not the same as keeping it low by any other measure. Afterward, he had donated to a children's hospital under a shell company and told himself the ledger balanced. He had actually believed that. The Cha family made contact with my foundation last Tuesday. The mother, her name is Bora, she is 41, she has 2 daughters in secondary school, came in person. She didn't know who I was beyond the foundation's name. She sat across from me in my office and she held her handbag in her lap with both hands and she told me about her husband in the careful, edited way people speak about the dead when the circumstances of the death cannot be spoken plainly in a room full of strangers. Yun-Seo's eyes stopped moving. He read the name again. Cha. He knew that name. He had not said it aloud since March. I told her our foundation had an emergency relief program for families experiencing sudden financial hardship. I told her the disbursement was anonymous, as per donor instructions, and that there was no application process, only a verification of need. She cried in a way that embarrassed her, and I handed her a box of tissues and waited without looking away, because I have learned that people who are grieving need to be looked at, not around. Before she left, she held my hand and said she had been terrified of what her boys, her brothers-in-law, might do to find justice for her husband. I told her I hoped the assistance would bring her family some peace. I meant it in more ways than she understood. The room felt smaller. Yun-Seo set the diary on the bed and pressed the heel of his palm hard against his sternum, as though he could physically contain what was expanding behind it. He stayed that way, head bowed, one hand against his chest, breathing with the deliberate control of a man who has trained himself never to break, and then he picked it back up because stopping now felt like a cowardice he hadn't earned. Bora Cha is the 11th family. I keep a separate ledger, not in the Foundation's official records, in a notebook I keep in my office at the charity building. The disbursements are structured as anonymous donor grants. They are untraceable back to me, and entirely untraceable back to him. I made sure of that first. I am many things, but I am not careless with his safety, even when I am furious with him. Even when she was furious with him. He turned the page. His hand was not steady and he had stopped pretending otherwise. I am not doing this to protect his empire. I want to be honest with myself here, in these pages, because this is the only place I am fully honest. I am doing this because grief metastasizes. I have watched it happen, a family's loss curdling slowly into a need for retaliation, and retaliation breeding more of the same darkness in an unbroken chain. I cannot stop what he does. But I can interrupt the aftermath. I can stand in the space between his violence and its echo and absorb enough of the damage that the chain, at least, does not lengthen. It is not enough. I know it is not enough. But it is what I have. Yun-Seo closed his eyes. His wife had been quietly, methodically, at enormous personal risk, building a bridge between his destruction and its consequences, with her own hands, her own resources, her own carefully constructed silence. 11 families. He hadn't known the names of half of them. She had learned all of them. The next entry had no date at the top. Just a time, 11:47 p.m., and 3 words before the main entry began. I was right. Yun-Seo read the 2 pages that followed without moving, without blinking with any regularity, without breathing as deeply as a man his size needed to breathe. By the end he was sitting differently, spine no longer straight, shoulders drawn inward, the particular posture of someone who has absorbed a blow they never saw coming and is still processing the physics of it. I had noticed the men at the restaurant for the 3rd time in 2 weeks. Different tables, different clothing, same eyes, the kind that are working even when the face around them is pretending to rest. Yun-Seo didn't see him. He was in conversation with Min Jae and his attention was internal, the way it gets when decisions are being made behind his expression. I excused myself to the restroom and on the way I stopped at the bar and spoke to the sommelier, who I have a friendly relationship with, and I asked quietly whether the man near the east window was a regular. He was not. He had paid in cash and asked the host, earlier, what time our reservation was. Yun-Seo's grip on the diary tightened. I went back to the table and told Yun-Seo I was feeling unwell, a headache. I said, could we possibly leave? He looked at me for a moment with that particular expression he uses when he is deciding whether something is true. I held his gaze and kept my face soft and tired. He called for the bill. We left through the kitchen at my suggestion. I told him the main exit was too bright for my head. He accepted this. We took the back car. I watched the east window as we pulled out. The man was already on his phone. She had engineered their exit. She had read the room faster than his own security and maneuvered them both out of danger using nothing but a headache and a quiet word to a sommelier. He turned the page. I didn't sleep that night. I ran the face through every contact I had, carefully, in ways that could not be traced to curiosity about syndicate business, and by morning I had enough to pass an anonymous tip to a source I trust inside the investigative bureau. Not enough information to implicate Yun-Seo in anything. Enough to ensure the man would find himself the subject of sufficient scrutiny to make his assignment impractical. He left the city 4 days later. I watched the restaurant for 2 weeks after, just to be certain. There was a short paragraph break. then. He never knew any of this happened. He came home those 4 days later, same as always, composed, distant, present the way a piece of furniture is present. He ate the meal I had prepared and answered 3 work calls and went to bed. I lay beside him in the dark and I thought, I have just kept you alive and you will never know, and somehow that is both the loneliest and the most clarifying thing I have ever experienced. Because I didn't do it for acknowledgement. I did it because the alternative, a world in which that man at the east window succeeded, was one I was not willing to live in. That told me something about myself I hadn't fully admitted yet. The diary trembled slightly in Yun-Seo's hands. Not because he was weak. Because he was realizing, with the slow and devastating momentum of a collapsing structure, that the life he believed he had built alone, every year of it, had been quietly, invisibly, shouldered by the woman sleeping on the other side of their bed. He had called her a shadow. She had been the architecture holding the entire thing upright. He turned the page, though part of him understood that every page he turned now was costing him something he would not be able to reclaim. This entry was longer than the others. The handwriting was the same, controlled, deliberate, but the letters were pressed slightly harder into the page, as though the pen had needed more guidance than usual. As though the hand holding it had been less steady than Samara typically allowed herself to be. It was dated 11 months ago. A Sunday. He sat across from me at breakfast this morning for 22 minutes. I counted. Not obsessively, I was reading, and I noted the time when he arrived and noted it again when he left, the way you note small data points that accumulate into a pattern you are trying to understand. In 22 minutes, he looked at me once. When he refilled his coffee. His eyes moved across my face the way they move across a room he has already cleared for threats, efficiently, without lingering, filing me under safe and moving on. I have become safe to him. I used to think that was enough. Yun-Seo read the line again. He remembered that Sunday. He remembered the coffee. He could not have told you Samara had been in the room. The loneliness of this marriage is not the kind that announces itself. It doesn't arrive like grief, all at once, demanding to be felt. It arrives the way damp arrives in old buildings, slowly, through the smallest gaps, until one morning you notice the damage has been structural for quite some time. I am lonely in the specific and terrible way of a person who is never physically alone. I sleep beside him. I share his table, his name, his city. And I am lonelier than I have ever been in any room by myself. He had to stop. He pressed 2 fingers against his mouth and looked at the rain-dark window for a long moment before he could continue. I don't tell anyone this. There is no one to tell. The women in his circle are either too close to the syndicate or too far from the truth of what this life looks like from the inside. My friends from before, the ones who knew me as Samara Adeyemi, before the Han name, I have kept at a careful distance, for their safety and for the privacy his world requires. My mother calls every Sunday and asks how I am, and I tell her I am well, and I mean it in the narrowest possible sense. I am healthy. I am fed. I am safe. I am so profoundly unseen that some mornings I stand in front of the bathroom mirror for a few extra seconds just to confirm I am still here. Something inside Yun-Seo's chest moved in a way that had no name in any language he spoke. What I grieve most is not romance. I did not marry him expecting tenderness. What I grieve is simpler and somehow more painful than that. I grieve the conversations we have never had. I grieve the times I have said something true and watched it land in the silence between us and dissolve, unacknowledged. I grieve the version of him I saw at that window 4 years ago, the exhausted, unguarded version, because I have never seen him since and I am beginning to wonder if I imagined it. I have not imagined it. I know I haven't. I have simply married a man who has decided that being known is more dangerous than being alone. And I don't know how to reach him. And I am running out of the particular energy it takes to keep trying without any signal that the trying is received. I keep trying anyway. I don't entirely know why. Perhaps that is a question for another entry. The page ended there. Yun-Seo sat in the silence of the room she had described, the same room, the same quiet, and understood for the first time that the peace he had always found here had been built entirely on her willingness to bear what he had never once noticed she was carrying. The final entry was dated 6 days ago. He knew it was the final entry because the pages after it were blank, clean, cream white, waiting for words that had not yet been written. He knew it was the final entry because something in the quality of her handwriting had changed again, in a different direction this time. Not pressed harder, like the Sunday entry. Lighter. The careful, deliberate lightness of someone who has made a decision and is writing from the far side of it, where the anguish has already been processed and what remains is something quieter and more permanent than grief. Resolution. I have been trying to find the right words for this entry for several days. I have started it 4 times. Each time I got as far as the first sentence and then closed the book because I wasn't ready to make it real by writing it down. I am ready now. Or I am as ready as I will be, which is not the same thing but will have to serve. Yun-Seo's breathing had changed. He didn't notice. I am going to leave. The words sat on the page in the same controlled cursive as everything else she had ever written. No dramatic underline. No tear-stained smudge on the ink. Just the sentence, clean and final, the way Samara did everything, with a composure that cost more than anyone around her ever understood. Not immediately. I have arrangements to make, the foundation has ongoing commitments that need to be properly transitioned, and there are 3 families still mid-process in the disbursement program who need continuity of contact. I will not leave them without a structure in place. I will not leave anything without a structure in place. That is, I have come to understand, both my greatest strength and the habit that has kept me here 2 years longer than wisdom probably advised. He turned the page. His hand was shaking now with the openness of it, no longer something he bothered to conceal from himself or the empty room. I want to be precise about why. I am not leaving because I am afraid of him. I have never been afraid of him, not once, which I recognize is its own complicated statement about my psychology. I am not leaving because the life is too dangerous or the silence too heavy or the loneliness too sharp, though all of those things are true. I am leaving because I have finally answered the question I wrote in this diary 4 years ago, standing at a window across a crowded room. I asked whether anyone would ever love him loudly enough for both of them. The answer is no. Not because the love isn't present. Mine has been present every single day of this marriage, in every form I knew how to give it. But love, I have learned, cannot do its work in a person who has sealed every point of entry. You cannot love someone into receiving love. You cannot pray a man open who has decided that openness is the same as destruction. I have tried. I have tried in ways he will never know the full extent of, and some of those ways are recorded in these pages, and none of them have moved him a single degree closer to seeing me. And I deserve to be seen. I have known this for a long time. I am only now willing to act on it. There was a paragraph break. A long one. As though she had set the pen down and picked it up again from a different place inside herself. I hope he finds his way. I will pray for that long after I am gone. That is not something I am capable of stopping. I hope someone reaches him eventually. I hope he lets them. I hope, somewhere in whatever life comes after this one, he knows he was loved. Completely. Without condition. By someone who saw exactly what he was and chose him anyway. That has to be enough now. It has to be. The diary slipped from Yun-Seo's hands. It landed on the floor between his feet and he did not pick it up. He sat on the edge of their bed in the city's rain-soaked darkness, his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and the most feared men in the region made a sound he had not made since he was a child, standing over his father's coffin, raw, unguarded, wrenched from somewhere so deep it had no address. 6 days ago, she had already been saying goodbye. And he had sat across from her at dinner and not noticed. He didn't hear the elevator. He had been sitting on the floor for some time, he wasn't certain how long. At some point he had moved from the bed to the floor without consciously deciding to, the way a man moves when his legs stop being interested in maintaining the performance of composure. The diary was in his lap. His jacket was beside him, discarded at some point he couldn't recall. His tie was loose, his top buttons open, and the dragon tattoo that men across the city had learned to fear was visible at his collar, still and quiet against his skin. The rain had not stopped. He heard the front door. The particular sound of it, the soft electronic release of the security panel, the gentle weight of the door, the almost imperceptible shift in air pressure that moved through the penthouse when the outside world was briefly admitted, landed in his chest like a struck bell. Her footsteps crossed the marble entryway. Unhurried. The sound of a woman returning home from an evening out, tired in the elegant, bone-deep way of someone who performs wellness for others for hours at a stretch. He heard her set something down on the entryway table, her clutch, probably. Heard the quiet sound of heels being removed. Then silence. She had noticed the bedroom light. Her footsteps resumed, softer now without the heels, moving down the hallway toward the room. He did not move. He did not arrange himself or straighten his spine or manufacture any version of the composure he had spent his entire adult life maintaining as automatically as breathing. He had nothing left with which to do any of that. The bedroom door, already half open, swung wider. He heard her breath catch. Not loudly. Samara did not do things loudly. It was barely a sound at all, just a fractional interruption in her breathing, the tiniest seam in her composure opening and closing in under a second. But he heard it. He realized distantly, only now learning how precisely and completely he could hear her when he was actually listening. She stood in the doorway in a deep green dress, her hair pinned at the neck, a short strand of gold at her collarbone. She looked composed and formal and exhausted in the way her diary had described, the weariness of a woman who carries things and does not set them down in public. Her eyes moved from his face to his hands to the diary in his lap, and something shifted behind them, not panic, not anger, something older and more complicated than either. She knew immediately what it was. Of course she did. Yun-Seo. Her voice was very quiet. He looked up at her from the floor. He had no prepared words. He had, for the first time in his adult life, nothing prepared at all, no position, no strategy, no controlled response waiting behind his expression. Just his face, open and wrecked, and her name somewhere in his throat that he couldn't get past the damage the last several hours had done. Samara did not move for a long moment. She stood in the doorway and looked at him, truly looked at him, the way he now understood she had always looked at him, fully and without flinching, and he watched something cross her face that broke what was left of him entirely. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even hurt, though the hurt was there, present and real, visible in the careful set of her jaw. It was recognition. The exhausted, complicated recognition of a woman seeing, for the first time in years of trying, that the men she had loved in secret had finally, at enormous cost, begun to see her back. She stepped into the room. She sat down on the floor beside him, green dress, bare feet, diary between them, and she said nothing at all. Neither did he. The rain filled the silence. It was, somehow, enough. She spoke first. Not immediately, they sat together on the floor for a long time before either of them found the edge of language. The city moved below them, indifferent and glittering, and the rain continued its low conversation against the glass, and Samara sat with her knees drawn slightly to the side in the way women sit when they have not planned to be on the floor, her hands folded in her lap with the particular stillness he now understood had never been passivity. It had always been strength. He had simply lacked the eyes to see the difference. "How much did you read?" she asked. "All of it." She absorbed this without visible reaction, the way she absorbed most things, completely, internally, giving nothing to the surface until she had processed it somewhere private first. He watched her do it and felt the loss of every year he had spent looking away from exactly this, the extraordinary, quiet machinery of her. "Then you know," she said. "I know." His voice was low and uneven in ways he didn't try to correct. "I know about the families. The restaurant. The shirt." He paused. "I know about the window. 4 years ago. I know what you saw." She turned to look at him then, fully, directly, in the way that had always made him feel, though he had never examined why, faintly exposed. "And what did I see?" she asked. Not as a test. As something she needed to hear him say. He held her gaze. He owed her that much. He owed her everything, but he could start there. Someone who had forgotten who he was, he said. Inexpensive clothes. Something moved through her expression, swift and unguarded, there and gone, and her eyes grew bright in a way she did not look away from him to hide. She let him see it. For the first time, he understood that she had always let him see things. He had simply never been present enough to receive them. "I'm leaving." Her voice was steady. "I meant what I wrote. I need you to know I meant it. I know you meant it. I can't stay because you read the diary, Yun-Seo. That's not," she stopped. Restarted. "That cannot be the reason." "It isn't," he said. "You staying isn't what I'm asking for." She watched him carefully. He reached down and placed his hand over hers, not gripping, not commanding, the way he touched everything in his life. Just his hand over hers, uncertain and deliberate and honest in a way that cost him more than any decision he had ever made from a position of power. "I'm asking for the chance to become someone worth staying for," he said. "Those are different things. I understand if you can't give me that. I understand if you've already," his voice fractured slightly on the word and he steadied it. "I understand if you've already spent everything you had. I read what it cost you. I know what I took without knowing I was taking it." Samara looked at their hands for a long moment. "You can't run the syndicate and become that person," she said quietly. "They're not compatible. You know that. I know that. I need you to understand what you're actually saying." "I do understand." He turned his hand beneath hers so their palms were together, and she let him. "I've understood since the third entry. I just needed to finish reading before I could say it honestly." The rain moved across the glass in long, slow rivers. Samara looked at him, the whole of him, broken open on the floor of the life they had built in separate silences, and she did not say yes. She did not say no. She turned her hand over and held his back. It was, he knew, more than he had earned. It was, he knew, exactly who she had always been. He closed his eyes and, for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, felt the specific and unfamiliar relief of being completely, terrifyingly, finally known. There is a kind of power the world teaches us to recognize early. It arrives in a certain quality of silence when a man enters a room. In the way other men's eyes move, quick, careful, deferential. In tailored suits and clean hands and the particular stillness of someone who has never needed to raise his voice because the world has always lowered its own. We are taught to read this power fluently, almost instinctively, the way we learn to read weather or danger or the mood of someone who controls our circumstances. What the world teaches us far less fluently is this, that power, in its truest form, has nothing to do with any of that. Yun-Seo Han controlled 23 districts. He commanded the loyalty of hundreds of men who would have walked into considerable darkness on the single, quiet authority of his word. He had built an empire that governments acknowledged without naming and rivals feared without approaching. By every metric the world offered for measuring such things, he was enormously, irrefutably powerful. And he had been, for years, one of the most helpless people in his own life. Helpless to see what was directly beside him. Helpless to receive what was being freely given. Helpless to recognize love when it arrived not in the form he expected, loud, transactional, legible, but in the form it actually takes when it is most genuine, quiet, costly, and completely unconcerned with being witnessed. This is what Samara understood that he did not. That the most significant things people do for one another are almost never the things that get seen. They happen in locked bathrooms with a stained shirt and a bar of soap. They happen in foundation offices across a table from a grieving woman clutching a handbag. They happen at restaurant bars in a quiet word to a sommelier, and in the dark beside a sleeping man whose soul someone has decided, without his knowledge or consent, is worth fighting for. They happen in diaries that nobody reads. In prayers that nobody hears. In the 11 families and the 4 years of watching and the particular endurance of a woman who kept showing up for a man who had never once shown up for her in return, not because she lacked self-respect, but because she possessed a quality rarer and more demanding than self-respect. She possessed radical empathy. Not the easy kind, the kind that extends grace to people who are easy to love. The difficult kind. The kind that looks at a man armored in coldness and violence and sees, without excusing any of it, the exhausted and frightened person underneath who built the armor because he had no other available material. The kind that says, I see what you are and I also see what you were before the world finished with you, and I refuse to pretend those are the same thing. This is not passivity. It is not weakness. It demands more strength than fear ever could, because fear is easy to perform and easy to maintain. Empathy requires you to stay open in a world that rewards closing, to remain soft in structures built entirely to reward hardness, to love without guarantee of return for as long as your integrity permits. Samara's integrity had permitted 4 years. The lesson she leaves, in those worn burgundy pages, in the quiet architecture of everything she built around a man too blind to see it, is not that love conquers all. Love does not conquer all. Sometimes love reaches its honest limit and the most loving thing remaining is to leave. The lesson is simpler and more demanding than conquest. It is this: look at the people beside you. Actually look. Not for what they provide or what they threaten or what category they occupy in the story you have written about your own life. Look at them the way Samara looked at a stranger by a window, fully, without agenda, long enough to see the truth. Because the people loving us most are often doing it in silence. And silence, as Samara knew better than anyone, is not absence. It is sometimes the loudest thing in the room. We are simply not always listening. Thank you for watching with us tonight at Mafia Moonlight Tales. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the silent love in your own life, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment below, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. We'll see you in the next tale.